The sky was an indifferent grey the day Eleanor Matthews arrived at Rosewood Home. The clouds hung heavy, smothering the sunlight, casting a dull shadow over everything, as though the universe itself was unimpressed by the transition she was about to make. The van that delivered her was impersonal, a cold steel box that smelled faintly of antiseptic and age. Two orderlies, young and distracted, barely spoke to her as they wheeled her inside. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned the futility of unnecessary conversation in recent months. Words were wasted in places where no one truly listened. Rosewood Home was known in town as a top-tier facility. Brochures promised elegant living and personalized care. There were pictures of smiling residents and warm, cozy lounges, but as the elevator doors opened onto the third floor, Eleanor noticed the faint peeling at the edges of the wallpaper, the flicker in the fluorescent lights. The long hallway that smelled more like bleach than warmth. She was led to room 307, her name already printed on a laminated sign beneath the room number. Eleanor Matthews, misspelled. A small error, but one that struck a sharp chord. She opened her mouth to correct it, then closed it again. Why bother? Eleanor had once commanded lecture halls, reciting Shakespeare and Dickinson from memory, moving generations of students with her voice and her insight. She had once been the woman everyone called for book club recommendations, the one who wrote fierce op-eds in local newspapers about politics, literature, justice. Now, she sat on a plastic-covered mattress in a room with a broken blind and a view of a dumpster. The staff were pleasant in that manufactured, surface-level way. A nurse named Clara popped in to introduce herself. "Hey there, Ellen. Let's get you all settled in, sweetheart." She patted Eleanor's hand without waiting for a response and began unpacking her suitcase. Eleanor winced at the name. "It's Eleanor," she said softly. Clara didn't seem to hear. Or didn't care. Clothes were folded into drawers she would never remember. A nurse's aide brought in a tray of pills and said, "Time for your meds, Grandma," even though Eleanor had no grandchildren. As the days passed, Eleanor became increasingly aware of her invisibility. Her preferences were never asked. Her books, the few she had managed to bring, were stored away in a closet. "Don't want you straining those eyes," they said. Meals were served at fixed times, with no regard for what she liked. The staff smiled, but never listened. Every conversation was a monologue delivered at her, not to her. When she tried to interject, they would politely nod and change the subject. It was disorienting, like yelling into a well and hearing no echo. Her roommate, Dolores, a former jazz pianist now lost to late-stage dementia, moaned softly in her sleep every night. Occasionally, she would mumble notes of a long-forgotten melody. Eleanor listened and felt an odd kinship. Two women, once vibrant, brilliant, now reduced to shadows of their former selves. They were relics in a museum no one visited. But the worst part wasn't the routines or the loss of autonomy. It was the erasure of identity, the constant mispronunciation of her name. The infantilizing tone staff used, calling her sweetie or darling, as if she were a child who needed coddling. One nurse even brought her a stuffed animal as a comfort buddy. Eleanor wanted to scream. She had faced war, buried a husband, raised a daughter, survived cancer. She didn't need a teddy bear. She needed to be seen. On the seventh evening, as the sun dipped low behind the cracked blinds, Eleanor sat at the small desk by the window with a pencil and a pad of paper. She began to write, slowly, deliberately. Not poetry, not prose, just notes, names, times, interactions. Nurse Clara, called me Ellen again, did not acknowledge correction. Aide Marcus took book from my lap mid-reading, said this is too advanced for you. A list, a ledger, a record of the indignities, small and large. It wasn't revenge she was after. Not yet. It was clarity. A way to remind herself she was still real, still capable of observation and analysis. She might be locked in a room with chipped paint and a broken call button, but her mind, her most powerful asset, was still intact. If they wouldn't remember her name, she would carve it into every page of that notebook until it echoed through the halls. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but that small act, writing it all down, was the first spark of a fire that would soon burn far beyond the walls of Rosewood Home. Nights at Rosewood Home had a strange silence to them, not peaceful, but heavy, like something deliberately held back. The halls quieted after dinner, lights dimmed to a sleepy yellow hue, and televisions hummed in the distance with old sitcoms no one really watched. Eleanor often lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, her thoughts far louder than the quiet around her. She could feel it, even in the stillness, that subtle sense of being observed and dismissed in equal measure. It wasn't paranoia, it was something colder, systemic, baked into the walls. Her notebook was now her only ally. Every evening she'd scribble down the day's encounters, who spoke to her and how, what was said, what was implied. Each entry felt like a small reclamation of dignity. Names, timestamps, fragments of overheard conversations, a growing archive of a life still paying attention. She'd begun hiding the notebook in a hollowed-out copy of Wuthering Heights, a small rebellion she found amusing in a darkly poetic way. The irony wasn't lost on her. Catherine's haunted moors traded for beige corridors and scratchy sheets. Then, one night, it happened. It began with the unmistakable sound of stifled laughter. Eleanor had just begun to drift into sleep when she heard it. Two voices in the hallway, hushed and conspiratorial, barely restrained behind the door. "She talks like she's still at the university or something," one whispered, snorting. "Miss Matthews, would you kindly not overcook the vegetables next time?" the other mimicked, their tone mocking, exaggerated. "I'm a scholar, you see. I read poetry," the first added, and both dissolved into giggles. Eleanor's heart thudded. She stayed perfectly still, her breath held, eyes open in the darkness. The door creaked slightly. A beam of hallway light spilled in. "She even talks to herself in verse. I recorded it yesterday." "Hold on, let me find it," the second voice said. There was a pause, followed by a muffled audio clip playing from a phone. Eleanor's own voice, soft and trembling, reciting Emily Dickinson under her breath. Then more laughter. "Creepy, right? Sounds like a haunted audiobook." It felt like a slap. Eleanor's face flushed with a mix of shame, fury, and disbelief. Her private world, the one piece of identity she had fought to keep, had been turned into a joke. Her poetry, her solace, her mind, reduced to viral content for someone's amusement. The door clicked shut. Silence returned, but everything had changed. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, breakfast was the same bland oatmeal, the same oversteamed eggs, but Eleanor barely touched them. Across the room, the two aides responsible for the laughter, Marcus and Lynn, went about their duties with practiced indifference. No one else seemed to notice. No one else ever noticed. The humiliation, Eleanor realized, was not in a grand spectacle, but in the quiet erosion of respect, day after day, behind doors that never stayed shut. Later that week, another resident, Mrs. Kensington, a frail woman with arthritis so severe her hands curled into themselves, began weeping during art therapy. "They hid my paints," she whispered, "said I was too slow." No one followed up. The moment passed. The culture was clear. Submission, silence, survival. Eleanor refused. That afternoon, she began a second notebook. This one wasn't just about herself. It contained detailed entries on everything she saw and heard, patterns of neglect, dismissive tones, unspoken cruelties. She paid closer attention than ever before. When Dolores was left in soiled sheets for hours, she recorded it. When a nurse forgot to give medication to the nonverbal Mr. Lutz and then blamed him for being uncooperative, she wrote down the time and dosage. Her notebook became a mirror held up to the facility's soul, one they had tried very hard not to see. But still, the laughter haunted her. It echoed in her mind during the quietest moments. Not because of the mockery itself. Eleanor had faced ridicule before. She had taught students who scoffed at classic literature. She had defended her values in hostile rooms. No, it was the helplessness, the way they stole her voice and replayed it for their own entertainment. She wasn't a human being to them. She was content. She was weird, old Eleanor, an amusement between TikToks and smoke breaks. And yet, she was not broken. One evening, as a storm raged outside and thunder cracked the sky in jagged intervals, Eleanor stood up from her chair with more strength than she thought she had left. She walked, unassisted, to the mirror above her dresser. She looked at herself, really looked. The lines on her face, the silver in her hair, the tired but still luminous eyes. She reached for her old reading glasses and slipped them on. Then she whispered, "I'm nobody. Who are you?" The words weren't for the aides, not for the phone cameras. They were for her, for the poet buried inside her bones, for the woman they had tried to reduce, but who had never truly been erased. The next morning, she shared her notebook with someone new, someone who was watching and listening. And everything began to change. The late spring sunlight filtered through the windows of Rosewood Home with little warmth. Outside, trees swayed gently in the breeze, a world in bloom that stood in stark contrast to the stagnant air within the facility's halls. Life happened beyond these walls, children laughing, cars humming by, lovers strolling parks. But inside, the days bled into one another like an endless silent winter. Eleanor, however, had not been idle. Since the night of the laughter, something within her had shifted. Not just a response to cruelty, but a quiet awakening. She kept writing, each page filled with more than just observations. It was a form of resistance, of bearing witness to the erasure happening around her. Her notebook now included testimonies of other residents, sketched maps of neglect, and quotes, always quotes, because she believed words held power even when spoken in empty rooms. But Eleanor was not alone. Not anymore. Jasmine had been assigned to Rosewood Home as part of a required community outreach program at her high school. She was 17. Fiercely independent, with her hair dyed the color of late cherries and earbuds perpetually tucked beneath her hoodie. At first glance, she appeared to be just another teen fulfilling her hours with boredom and apathy. She was often seen sweeping hallways or delivering clean linens with one AirPod discreetly hidden and a disinterested look on her face. But Jasmine was more observant than she let on, and she noticed Eleanor. It began with small things. While most residents stared vacantly or dozed off during lunch, Eleanor always sat upright. Her gaze was sharp, not dulled. Jasmine watched as Eleanor wrote in her notebook during activities others ignored. She noticed how Eleanor would flinch ever so slightly when a particular staff member entered the room, how her voice stiffened into cold formality, like a soldier recalling a drill. Jasmine saw Eleanor correct people only to be ignored day after day, and that stirred something inside her, something raw and familiar. One afternoon, as she changed out a vase of wilted flowers in the common area, Jasmine heard the soft murmur of poetry from the far corner. Eleanor, almost inaudibly, was reading aloud from memory, Emily Dickinson again. They shut me up in prose, as when a little girl they put me in the closet, because they liked me still. The voice was quiet, but unwavering. Jasmine paused. She knew those words, not just from school, but from her grandmother, who had died in a care home much like this one just a year earlier. Her grandmother had once recited the same poem, in that same whispering cadence, until her voice was taken by dementia and pills and the loneliness of being forgotten. That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. She replayed the image of Eleanor in her mind, so poised, so lucid, so ignored. The parallel between Eleanor and her late grandmother was too sharp to ignore. So the next day she sat beside Eleanor for the first time. "You like Dickinson?" she asked, as if it were just casual small talk. Eleanor looked up, wary. Most of the staff spoke to her in tones reserved for toddlers or patients. Jasmine's voice was different, Curious, direct. "She's the last voice they haven't taken from me," Eleanor replied flatly. Jasmine smiled faintly. "She was my grandma's favorite, especially when she was, fading." She hesitated. "Can I ask what you're writing?" Eleanor studied her face. There was no mockery, no pity, only a cautious sincerity. "You may," Eleanor said, closing the notebook and laying it gently on her lap. "But only if you promise not to laugh." Jasmine leaned in. "I promise." That single moment of trust changed everything. Over the next few days, the two formed a quiet bond. Jasmine began spending her breaks in Eleanor's room, reading her notes, asking questions. What started as curiosity evolved into outrage. Eleanor shared the story of the laughter, the recording, the subtle humiliations that went unchecked. Jasmine's face flushed with anger. She had heard the way some aides spoke when they thought no one could hear, snide remarks, jokes made at the residents' expense. But she had never connected the cruelty to something so personal, so intimate. It wasn't just Eleanor's story, it was everyone's. Jasmine made a choice. She began documenting things herself, photos of bruises unexplained, timestamps of medication delays, audio clips of condescending voices and dismissive words. She did it all in secret, always careful, always quiet. Eleanor didn't ask her to. She didn't need to. Jasmine understood that silence was complicity, and she refused to be another pair of blind eyes in the hallway. One evening, Eleanor handed Jasmine a slip of paper. It had a single sentence written in her familiar looping script. "When one voice joins another, even the silence begins to tremble." Jasmine folded it into her pocket. That night, she uploaded the first video. It was a simple recording, Eleanor in her room, reading softly to herself, while a nurse entered and ripped the book from her hands with the words, "You don't need that." The clip ended on Eleanor's stunned expression, not of fear, but of weary resignation. Jasmine added only one caption. Her name is Eleanor, and she remembers everything. What neither of them knew was that this one post, this quiet defiance, would reach millions by week's end. The video spread like wildfire. At first, it was a ripple, a handful of views, a few comments from classmates on Jasmine's private account. Then a retweet from a local news blogger turned that ripple into a wave. By the end of the third day, the clip had amassed over 200,000 views. By the fifth, it had crossed 1 million, and yet, inside Rosewood Home, nothing changed, not right away. Eleanor didn't even know about the video until Jasmine hesitantly told her during a morning visit. Jasmine had expected anger. Betrayal, maybe. After all, she hadn't asked for permission to share something so intimate. But Eleanor just smiled, a thin, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "If my voice can still carry beyond these walls, let it." But the weight of that choice would soon test them both. A few days after the video went viral, a letter arrived at Rosewood's front desk. Then a second, then a flood. Dozens, then hundreds of emails and letters began pouring in from around the country. Former students of Professor Eleanor Matthews, people who had once sat in her classroom quoting Keats and Faulkner, remembering the way she had challenged them to read not just with your eyes, but with your soul. Some were now professors themselves, journalists, lawyers, authors, all of them outraged, all of them demanding answers. At first, the administration at Rosewood tried to ignore it. The facility director, Mr. Dennis Ryland, brushed the matter aside as a misrepresentation. He called the video selectively edited, a violation of policy, and claimed Eleanor's behavior was erratic. But the public didn't buy it, especially not after a second video surfaced. This one wasn't filmed by Jasmine. It was taken by another staff member, anonymously leaked, and it showed something impossible to refute. Eleanor being called delusional and a problem case by a senior nurse. In the video, Eleanor quietly corrects the pronunciation of her own name, only to be met with rolled eyes and a muttered, "Whatever, Ellen." The damage was done. The truth was undeniable. News crews began camping outside the facility. A local anchor tried to schedule an interview with Eleanor, but the administration blocked all media access. Jasmine received a warning from the staff director. If she was caught filming again, she'd be reported and banned. But it was too late to stop what had already begun. Eleanor, meanwhile, became a name again. Not just a patient, but a person, a symbol. But with the attention came consequences. Tensions within the facility grew rapidly. Some of the nurses treated Eleanor with forced politeness. Others turned cold. One evening, her dinner was delivered an hour late and ice cold. The aide simply shrugged. "Kitchen's busy," she said. A week later, Eleanor found her notebook missing. It wasn't in her hiding place. It wasn't under her mattress or behind her books. Panic surged through her like wildfire. That notebook had been her armor, her record, her truth, her voice. And now, it was gone. Jasmine searched every inch of the room. Nothing. She confronted Ryland directly, accusing him of confiscating it. He denied everything. But the next morning, Eleanor's books were missing too. It was an unspoken message. Be quiet, or be erased. Jasmine was furious. "We can go public. I'll tell the news stations they're targeting you." But Eleanor placed a hand gently over hers. "No," she said, "not yet. There's something more powerful than outrage. We just need the right moment." That moment came sooner than expected. One of Jasmine's videos had caught the attention of a journalist from a major national outlet, someone who had been a student of Eleanor's 25 years ago. She requested an exclusive interview. But this time, instead of sneaking around, she sent a legal request for access, backed by Eleanor's signed permission. The facility couldn't block it. They tried to delay, of course, claimed she was unwell, but Eleanor insisted. She sat for the interview in the library, the one room she insisted on using. Jasmine helped her prepare, brushing her hair, buttoning her blouse. Eleanor refused to be seen in a gown or robe. "If they remember me," she said, "they will remember me, not a patient." The interview aired 2 days later. It was quiet, raw, and powerful. Eleanor didn't cry, she didn't beg. She spoke, calmly, clearly, with a professor's grace and a survivor's truth. She spoke of being reduced, of having her voice mocked, of the moment she realized silence was a kind of death, and she ended it with a single quote from Dickinson. "The soul should always stand ajar, ready to welcome the ecstatic experience." The country listened. Lawmakers weighed in. Advocacy groups began petitioning for elderly care reform. Civil rights attorneys offered to represent her pro bono. Rosewood's board of directors launched a formal internal investigation. Within a week, Nurse Lynn and aide Marcus were placed on administrative leave. More suspensions followed, but the most unexpected twist came days later. A letter, handwritten, slid under Eleanor's door. It was from a young nurse. "I'm sorry," I laughed. "I didn't understand what I was doing until I saw your face. You reminded me of my grandmother. I'm so ashamed." Eleanor read it twice, then folded it and placed it in her new notebook. This time, no one would steal it. It started with a statement, a short, unembellished release from the Rosewood Homes Board of Directors, quietly uploaded to their seldom visited website. An independent investigation is underway following recent media attention and allegations concerning treatment of residents. Rosewood remains committed to upholding dignity, safety, and respect. No names were mentioned, no apologies were offered. It was meant to be a gesture, a token response to calm the growing noise. But the noise would not quiet. By now, Eleanor Matthews was no longer a faceless resident on the 3rd floor. She was a symbol. A once-forgotten woman who had spoken against an invisible cruelty millions recognized but rarely discussed. Her story struck a nerve, not just among the elderly or their families, but across generations. The notion of dignity, of being seen, resonated in a world where people were so often overlooked. The reckoning didn't arrive with a bang. It came in a series of subtle tremors, each one loosening the foundations of the lie Rosewood had built around itself. The first came when a retired judge from the state's Elder Justice Board made a public statement on live television. What happened to Ms. Matthews is a symptom of something systemic. What we've seen isn't isolated, it's common, and it's unacceptable. Then came the former employees. At first, one aide anonymously called into a podcast, admitting she had seen residents mocked behind closed doors. Then another stepped forward, a nurse who had quit 6 months prior, disillusioned by the culture of silence and shortcuts. We were told to move fast, not care deep. People became paperwork. Jasmine kept collecting everything. Screenshots, testimonies, time-stamped audio clips. She worked with a local legal aid organization to help sort and verify it all. What had started as an act of defiance became a body of evidence. Meticulous, damning, undeniable. Meanwhile, Eleanor watched it all unfold from her corner room, her hands always poised with a pen, her eyes filled with something between awe and grief. She hadn't imagined this. Not really. She had wanted to reclaim her name, not ignite a national discussion. But now that the floodgates were open, she was determined not to let them close. The formal investigation began in full. External auditors arrived unannounced. Clipboards, cameras, questions. They examined medication records, staffing logs, video surveillance. Residents were interviewed privately. Families were contacted. Complaints that had been dismissed as misunderstandings were re-evaluated. The truth was scattered throughout the building, hidden in plain sight, buried in drawers, written in the folds of unwashed laundry. In the third week of the inquiry, something unexpected occurred. The daughter of a Rosewood resident approached the facility during visiting hours and asked to speak to Eleanor. Her name was Helen Tan, and she held a printed photo in her hand, a picture of her father, slumped in his chair with a bruised arm Eleanor had documented weeks before. "I didn't know," Helen said, her voice cracking. "He kept saying he was falling a lot. I thought he was confused. I didn't want to believe." Eleanor placed a gentle hand over Helen's and said softly, "Now you do." Helen wasn't the only one. Families began demanding to see their loved ones' records. They asked questions. They took photos. Rosewood, once a quiet fortress of routine, was now a hive of accountability. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The interim report from the Independent Oversight Committee was made public. Its findings were damning: systemic neglect, failure to adhere to basic patient care protocols, unethical staff conduct, and retaliation against residents who voiced complaints. It concluded with a single chilling line: the institutional culture at Rosewood Home prioritized silence over dignity. The consequences were swift. Dennis Ryland, the facility's director, was forced to resign. Several nurses and aides, including the infamous Marcus and Lynn, were officially terminated. The state's Department of Health Services announced immediate oversight reforms for elder care facilities, including mandatory dignity training and harsher penalties for abuse and neglect. But for Eleanor, the real triumph came not in headlines or lawsuits, but in something quieter. She was invited to speak, not on camera, not for ratings, but at a university, her old university. A literature symposium on ethics in storytelling asked her to give a keynote speech on the power of narrative and memory. They offered to send a car. She declined. "I'll walk in," she said, "if only from the curb." And she did. With Jasmine wheeling her gently across the lecture hall floor, Eleanor took the podium to a standing ovation. Her hair was silver, her steps slow, but her voice carried like it always had, precise, powerful, unwavering. She began her talk not with a complaint, but with a poem. "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality." There was silence. Not the empty kind she had known at Rosewood, but reverent, electric, alive. In that moment, the reckoning was complete. Not because the guilty were punished, but because Eleanor was finally, undeniably heard. A year had passed since the world first heard Eleanor Matthews' voice echo from behind the sterile walls of Rosewood Home. That voice, once mocked, dismissed, and silenced, had become the spark for something much greater than any of them imagined. After the investigation and the sweeping reforms that followed, Eleanor had returned to something she never expected to find again in the final chapter of her life: purpose. She still lived at Rosewood, though it had changed almost entirely. The facility, under new management, had undergone renovations, not just structural but cultural. The hallways were repainted in warm, welcoming tones. Staff wore name badges that included a simple yet radical addition: "Ask me how I can help you today." There were signs in the common areas with a new motto, proposed by a committee that included residents. "Every name has a story. Listen before you speak." Eleanor had been asked if she wanted to leave. The new director had offered to transfer her anywhere at the facility's expense, but she refused. She chose to stay, not out of comfort or stubbornness, but because she believed the soil where the damage was done should also be the ground where healing took root, and she had no intention of being a passive resident. Jasmine, now in her final year of high school, visited every week. What began as a required volunteer project had transformed her future. She had changed her college plans and was now preparing for pre-law, specializing in elder justice. "Because someone has to speak for those the world tries to forget," she would say. Eleanor never told her this directly, but watching Jasmine grow gave her a rare kind of peace, the kind she thought she had buried years ago. Together, they launched the initiative Name Me With Respect, a non-profit campaign promoting dignity in elderly care facilities across the country. The program developed simple but transformative training protocols for caregivers, emphasizing empathy, memory, and language. Within months, they were featured on national news again, not for tragedy, but for change. Eleanor became a speaker, not through tours or shows, but in carefully chosen moments. Libraries, classrooms, online forums where caregivers, students, and activists gathered to learn from her. She didn't want a spotlight. She wanted impact. When asked what the most important part of her journey had been, she always answered the same way: being heard again and teaching others to listen. One spring morning, Eleanor sat at a wooden desk newly installed in the facility's renovated library. It was smaller than the one she had once owned in her old home, but it faced a window, a wide, beautiful one that let in golden morning light. A potted plant sat beside her, a gift from a new resident who had arrived shy and silent 2 months earlier, and who now laughed freely during game nights. Eleanor had written her name correctly, in bold letters on the welcome card. It had mattered. She opened a leather-bound journal, a gift from Jasmine. Inside, handwritten in clean ink on the first page, was a quote: "The right word may be effective, but no word was ever as effective as a rightly timed pause." Mark Twain. She smiled. Then she began writing. Not lists or logs this time, not witness accounts or memories of injustice. This was something new. She was drafting her first essay for a book she had decided to write, tentatively titled "Still Here, Letters from the Third Floor." It would be part memoir, part manifesto. She wasn't sure who would read it, but that didn't matter. The act of writing it was enough. Outside, the seasons had shifted. Residents strolled the gardens with aides who now called them by name and asked questions like, "What's your favorite color?" or "Tell me something about your childhood." The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been perfect, but it was real, and it was lasting. Occasionally, Eleanor would receive letters. One from a nursing student in Ohio who said, "You made me realize the kind of nurse I want to be." Another from a woman in Canada who had pulled her mother from a toxic home after watching the first viral video. "You saved her," the woman wrote. "She's painting again." Eleanor read each one with quiet gratitude, not as validation but as a reminder that one voice, one determined voice, could shift the world when paired with courage and a little help from someone who cared enough to listen. Later that evening, Eleanor walked the hallway slowly, her cane tapping softly against the newly polished floors. She paused by a door and knocked gently. "Come in," said a nervous voice. Inside was a new resident, a retired high school principal named Mr. Greer. He was sharp, proud, and, as she had once been, deeply skeptical of everyone. He looked up as she entered. "I brought you something," Eleanor said, handing him a small notebook and a pen. "In case there's something you'd like to say." He raised an eyebrow. "And who would I say it to?" She smiled, her eyes glinting with wisdom earned through fire. "To someone who'll finally listen." And just like that, a new story began. If Eleanor's story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful true stories, and share this video to give a voice to those who can't speak up for themselves. Every name has a story, and together we make sure they're never forgotten. See you in the next chapter.